Well, thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Evan Pandel. I am the business development manager here at Associa. My job is to work with current and new board members to essentially help them educate them to be very knowledgeable in what's going on, current events that might affect your association. Tonight's guest speaker, we have Jeff Kaman from Kaman and Cusimano. With that being said, I'd like to pass the mic over to Jeff.
Thanks, Evan. Well, appreciate you having me here tonight, and I appreciate all of the volunteer board members for your time in listening to a lawyer of all people talk about one of the most riveting and exciting topics that you can imagine at 6 o'clock in the evening in a beautiful summer day, reserves. And I do say it is really kind of an important and an exciting topic because over the past few years, this whole concept of reserves might be one of the hottest topics facing all of community associations. And a big reason for that is we're marking the couple-year anniversary now of the Surfside tragedy, of that tower in Surfside, Florida collapsing. And after reviewing all of what happened there and the facts, I think what the ultimate takeaway has been for the community association industry at large is that this was an avoidable tragedy. And it could have been avoided had owners and boards and whomever in community associations taken the necessary action to make sure that they're being well funded so that way the property could be maintained and we wouldn't be in this predicament. And so a lot of that you'll hear me talk about tonight really has that as an undertone of a lot of this is now designed towards, we're representing communities, right? And so we need to make sure that the structural integrity of the buildings and the safety of the residents is absolutely at our highest priority. And so that's where the title of tonight's presentation is Reserves Mandates to Maintain Your Community, because board members really do today, more than ever, have that mandate to maintain your community. So who am I? I'm Jeff Kaman. Our law firm is Kaman and Cusimano. We only represent community associations in 4 states, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Wisconsin. And I like to think that our job as community association lawyers is to keep our board members and their professional management out of trouble. Not just represent them when they get into trouble, which is why I really like these educational proactive things. I appreciate Associa putting them on, and I appreciate all of you attending this presentation tonight. I am also a member of the College of Community Association Lawyers, CCAL. I'm a CCAL fellow, which is about 150 lawyers from around the country that all we do is community association law and have done teaching and things of that nature. On that, as part of that, I actually chair the Community Association Institute's Case Law Committee, where I have a team of attorneys from around the country. We read every Court of Appeals case and higher, believe it or not, in the United States. So about 400 cases a year and then present them at our annual law seminar. And one of the really neat things about doing that is that we can see these trends happening, especially on the coasts. We can see case law happening in Florida and New York and California and Arizona, and we see it then starting to make its way closer to middle America. And by case law, I'm talking about people suing each other over different things. And one of the things that there's been an uptick over in the last few years are lawsuits over this concept, reserves, which is why, again, the theme tonight is you've got a mandate to maintain your community. So I'm going to talk for the next, we'll see, maybe 30, 45 minutes or so, and then there's time for Q&A at the end. If you do have questions, you can put them into the little chat or the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many of those. Evan, we'll take as many of those as we can at the end. So starting off, there's a few concepts that I would just like you to keep in mind. We'll do some concepts and definitions. The first is expenses are inevitable. And this might be the thing that is perhaps most overlooked when we're talking about community association maintenance, and that is you've got components. And they're going to hit the end of their useful life, whether you're a condominium and you have roofs, or whether you're an HOA and you've got fences and walking paths. At some point, some point, those things are going to have to go through a major repair or replacement. And who's responsible for those? I mean, it's the association. There's generally no way out of that. It's the association, and the board is the one that has to make those decisions. And so expenses are inevitable, and the board has to make them. Sometimes, though, boards find themselves in a position that they want to delay. And really what I would tell you is that the only thing that happens when you delay is that expenses go up. I mean, shoot, we've had so many clients who wish today that they would have done their roofing or their asphalt work 3 or 4 years ago before the massive inflation we've seen over the past few years. It's not uncommon for things to cost 20, 30, 40, 50% more today than they did just 5 years ago, especially in central and southern Ohio because of all the construction and the construction costs. And so delays almost always add to the expense. They don't make it more economical. And who's got to pay the bill? The owners do. Because we don't get to raise the price of beer on game days or sell T-shirts to raise money for the association. Where does it come from? It comes from our assessment income, which is almost exclusively from the ownership. And so owners are always going to be paying for this. And sometimes boards will make a mistake of thinking, well, we'll just have insurance. Now, that can be the case sometimes. You'll have that magical hailstorm from heaven that comes down and gives us new roofs. But that's the exception, not the norm. And so when we're talking about these things, it's important to know that we're talking about the end of useful life, ordinary wear and tear. There's no insurance for that. Property insurance exists when there's sudden and unexpected events, right? That's the fires and the hailstorms and the pipes bursting and things of that nature. Those are things that are sudden and unexpected, not the end of life. It's just this thing happened. It was an accident. It was unfortunate. It was a mishap. There's insurance for that, but there's not insurance for these planned expenses. And so that concept of planning is really going to be important tonight. Some definitions that I'll have you keep in mind, and we'll talk more about these over as we go along. But when I'm talking about assessments, there's a lot of different types of assessments. Sometimes in condominiums, for example, sometimes we'll informally call them maintenance fees, but really it's an annual operating assessment. Sometimes in HOAs, that's just paid once a year or quarterly. In condominiums, it can be paid monthly, which is typical. But assessments applies every time we're charging the owners, whether it's a special assessment or not, is something that we'll talk about a little bit later. When I'm talking about the reserve account, I'm talking about actual funds on deposit, right? The money you have in your bank or listed in your balance sheet as part of your reserves. Third concept is fully funding of reserves. And this is an important distinction I'll draw a little bit later this evening as well, between the concept of fully funding and fully funded. That when we're combining the amount of money we have with our plan for the future, both our income and our expenses, that's when we can say we're fully funding. And lastly, and this is super important, and again, something that might come up later, is this concept of capital items. We can use reserves for repair or replacement of major capital items. And those are physical things that are existing on the property that deteriorate over time, typically that are made by man. So natural features, for example, like trees, are not typically capital. Natural ponds are often not capital, but stormwater ponds, which are made by human beings, usually are. We're typically talking about things, though, like fences and buildings and roads, stuff like that. What I will tell you is not a capital expense is operating costs, right? The money you spend on legal fees. Boy, I wish we could use reserves for that, but nope, unfortunately not. That's an operating expense. And so capital items, super important definition just for you to keep in mind, because when we're talking about reserves, we're talking about using reserve money for the repair and replacement of capital items. What I think experience has shown us over and over again is that insufficient reserves almost always results in negative consequences. And you really don't want to be the board in this cartoon where everybody's so amazed at what the association does at just $35 a month, and the building is deteriorating behind you. The windows are broken, trees are falling over, the siding's falling off. This is not something to be proud of. because ultimately these are the things that lead to the 5 different negative consequences which are on your screen tonight. Special assessments and bank loans. We'll talk about special assessments coming up next, but nobody's really planning for these. Not a lot of people have a bunch of money that they can just pay their association tomorrow for a special assessment. And so special assessments are usually negative. Likewise, deferred maintenance is a huge negative. When we talk about what drives property values, realtors like to say location, 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 which obviously is important, but what's a close second to that? It's how well is the property being maintained? And so deferring maintenance, not having those things being kept up, then has an immediate impact on number 3, which is declining home values. Further, not funding reserves today has caught the attention of other people. And primarily who it's caught the attention of are mortgage companies, banks, especially the big mortgage backers and underwriters, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, who back and repackage and sell all the conforming loans in the United States. If an association is not funding their reserves, they are much more hesitant to lend money to unit owners, potential unit owners, to buy units within that association. Why? Because they don't want to be left holding the bag. Just like the tragedy at Surfside, where now all of a sudden who's left? It's the insurance companies and the mortgage companies. This is not a great position to be in if you're them. And so they've really tightened up those requirements, which we'll talk about later. And then number 5, another super, super hot button topic today, insurance premiums. I mean, even associations with fully funded reserves are really seeing insurance premiums increase for a variety of market factors today. But we know now insurance companies are asking about this. They're looking at associations' balance sheets. They're asking to see copies of the reserve study because they want to know, hey, are we funding reserves? If the answer to that is no, and that they think then that there's going to be a lot more deferred maintenance, going back to number 2, that's when they see, there's probably more of a likelihood that one of those sudden and unexpected things is going to happen, and we're going to have a problem. And so they are underwriting property insurance policies based on that. If we think we're going to have a problem with that, then insurance companies also think they're going to have a liability insurance problem. If we know we have super old electrical wiring, or we're a building that's old and it has fires and no sprinkler systems, and we don't put in a sprinkler system and we have a fire and somebody dies, they might come after the association, not just from a property insurance standpoint, but a general liability standpoint. So it's also sometimes harder to obtain commercial general liability insurance like associations need to do if we're not funding reserves. And why is that important? Because all of these things go back into who pays? The owners. Money doesn't grow on trees again. We have to fund appropriately, or else all of these costs continue to go up. So let's talk about the dreaded special assessment, which certainly is dreaded. And the reason I say that is because, I know some board members, maybe some of you are on this webinar tonight, but they want to be popular. Like, they're really proud. We go to an annual meeting and the board will raise their hand and say, well, we have not raised the fees in 5 years. This usually is not a good sign. Now, they may win the short-term popularity contest, but over the long term, they're really doing the association a disservice if they're not at the same time able to be fully funding their reserves, because the remedy to not having enough money is, in most circumstances, this concept of a special assessment. And as this slide says, a special assessment is an assessment that's levied on association members in addition to the normal monthly, quarterly, or annual assessments. And just over the last couple of years, we've seen assessments all over the board as to how much they are. I mean, sometimes they're as low as $500, and sometimes we've seen special assessments over $50,000. You may not believe this, but probably at the end of last year, end of 2023, I was at an association's annual meeting, and they don't tell me what's happening before the meeting. I probably should have asked, but I didn't. And I get to this meeting and I say to the board, okay, what's happening tonight? Who's up for election? And they get through all that. And then they say, oh, by the way, we want you to address the special assessment. And I said, oh, what do you mean, what special assessment? They said, well, we have to levy a special assessment because we need new roofs. And we're a small community, and we found out when we do these roofs, we're also going to need to redo the siding because the roofs were so bad, the water's been leaking behind our wood siding. So we need to replace essentially the whole building envelope. And I said, whoa, that sounds expensive. How much you thinking there? And they're like, well, we think it's going to come to about $1.4 million. Okay, so that's a pretty big assessment. Then I'm looking at my notes, and this is before the meeting, and I realize, oh my gosh, there's only 14 units in this place. That was $100,000 special assessment that we levied at the meeting that night and told those people that, hey, by the way, we need new roofs and new siding, and all of you need to come up with $100,000. I don't know about you. I don't know about Evan, but I know about me. I don't have $100,000 that I just have sitting in the bank waiting for the association to tell me, oh yeah, can you write us the check by next week? Because we want to start the work before winter comes. No, like this can be substantial. And so there's lots of stories. I could go on and on and on about special assessments. There's another citation here on the slide where a community notified all the units, and I want to say there was like 75 or 80 units in this place of a special assessment of $27,000 that people only had 5 months to pay. That's a relatively recent experience that they needed to address roofs. When they started doing the roofs, they found black mold in the attics, and now all of a sudden it spiraled out of control. And we could have avoided this. How could we have avoided this? In a lot of the problems that we're talking about problems becoming worse, right? We didn't just need a new roof. We then needed new siding because the water leaked down. In this other circumstance, there was this, we need a new roof, but we didn't put a new roof on. We thought we could let it go a little bit. Water leaked into the attics and caused black mold. What did that do? That really drove up the price because now components that were fine had to get replaced. And so going back to some of those initial concepts, delaying our maintenance issues almost always leads to bigger expenses. And special assessments, in addition to just being practically bad news, oftentimes are technically bad news as well for a lot of different reasons because they result in a lot of bad things. First, there's almost always somebody who can't pay, right? Makes sense. Nobody has 100K. So what's that mean? It means foreclosures are being initiated by banks and also sometimes even the association. We also see lots of litigation, and this is where we see lawsuits happening, again, on the coast as well as locally, where people are suing each other. Sometimes it's buyers and sellers who's responsible for the special assessment. Sometimes it's from owners saying the board should have been funding this the whole time. Why didn't they? The board was negligent or derelict in their fiduciary duties to fund reserves. But then also, apart from all that, just general complaints. Some of you probably live in Green Acres. It is a pleasant, harmonious community, and your owners probably never complain about anything. But that would all change, even if you live there. You have to levy a special assessment. You've never seen owners complain until you send them a huge bill and tell them they have to pay right away. And so just as a practical political perspective, you may, again, be popular in the short term, but over the long term, it really presents a problem. And another problem that I will see is just a timing issue that I want to make you aware of. I think the overall theme of tonight is try to avoid special assessments. Just don't do them. If you have to do them, there's a lot of technicalities. And so would encourage you to work with your legal counsel to make sure that it's being done correctly. Special assessments usually require a special motion. There's a difference, believe it or not. This is why people hate lawyers, between the assessment date, a due date, and payable dates, and even sometimes then late dates. And so making sure all of those dates are super specified as to who is responsible for what is really, really important. And likewise, we also need to be able to communicate this effectively. It's not good if the board approves a special assessment in February and doesn't tell anybody about it until June. Now we have this break, and what happened? We levied it, but we didn't tell anybody who's actually responsible for it. Who pays? No idea. right? That usually goes back to there's a lawsuit and we make a judge figure it out. But then who's paying everybody? Because they have to pay the lawyers to fight about who's paying for it. And so nobody wins. Communicate, communicate, communicate. Also, I must tell you, some of you in your governing documents have specific requirements for special assessments, meaning that you have to maybe get an ownership vote, or you have to post notice or have a meeting, who knows, but you need to know if you're levying the special assessment. And so follow your governing documents. And again, that's something to talk to your legal counsel about. So special assessments are what to avoid. What do we do to prevent that? Well, the answer to that is now in the law. We have to fund our reserves. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the laws. The first one, as you can see on this slide, applies to condominiums. And there's a citation here to the Condominium Act in Ohio that says board shall annually adopt a budget for revenues and expenditures. And that budget has to include reserves in an amount adequate to repair and replace major capital items in the normal course of operations without the necessity of special assessments. What's that mean? Well, really just that. The law prohibits special assessments. Essentially, you can't do them. There's two exceptions to that. The first one is sometimes governing documents, again, will have limitation language that we can't increase the fees or something like that. And so we have to look to that, number one. And then number two, there is a way around that. If the board doesn't think that they can do that, they have to go every year for permission to the owners and get a majority vote of the owners to what's called waiving the reserve funding requirement. So in Ohio, for condominiums, it's super, super clear. Boards have an obligation to fund reserves so that way you can do these things without special assessments. That same thing is true for Ohio homeowners associations. Anybody who's not a condo, you're a HUD, you're an HOA, you're a master association, whatever you want to call yourself, if you're not a condominium, you have an almost identical statutory provision. You have to adopt a budget every year that repairs and replaces major capital items in the normal course of operations without the necessity of a special assessment. You still have that waiver out, which again, we'll talk about in a second, but you got to do it. So the law is abundantly clear. In Ohio, no special assessments. Some of you on the call tonight might be in Kentucky, especially northern Kentucky. And I will tell you, Kentucky at this point doesn't have any statutory mandates for reserves, but oftentimes your governing documents do. Now, again, you have to follow the provisions as it relates to reserves and special assessments, but the spirit of this law, as we'll talk about in a second, really applies nationally. So regardless of whether you're in Ohio or Kentucky or California or Timbuktu, having reserves is a super, super important thing because of something I mentioned earlier, and that are mortgagee requirements. Like I mentioned, Surfside was a terrible tragedy. And so as a country, I feel like we've been looking at ways to study how do we avoid this happening again. And the mortgage companies have really come down on that and are really insisting that associations be funding reserves. For example, you can see some of the Fannie and Freddie requirements on this slide, that we need to have separate bank accounts for reserve funds. The third bullet point, really important, no special assessments exist. Now, there can be some exceptions to that, and they'll look at the financial condition of the property. But in most cases, if they see a special assessment, they're running the other direction. Likewise, association has to provide a copy of their funding plan, which I'm going to call a reserve study for their maintenance and repair items. And that reserve study can't be more than 3 years old. So if they think that maybe the reserve balance isn't sufficient, they're going to ask for a copy of a reserve study, and that reserve study has to be relatively new. I'll talk more about reserve studies in a little bit as well. FHA has a similar requirement, right? We have to have separate accounts, no special assessments, and we have to have adequate reserves. So if you're one of the communities that often rely on FHA financing, this is also going to be important because FHA is paying attention to this. FHA, Fannie Mae, and Freddie Mac represent a super majority of loans issued to residential property in the United States. Can you get a non-conforming, non-warrantable loan? Yes, it just generally costs more. And those banks too can have underwriting requirements. And so they might also require you to have reserves. So the bottom line is, if you want your units to be eligible for financing, it's very, very important to have reserves. Where this can also be a major factor is the entities these days who have cash to buy are usually corporations, right? They're usually investor type people who are buying units and even homes for the purpose of renting them out. And so if owner occupancy levels are important to you and your community, making sure that our units are eligible for financing is a really good way to make sure that normal home buyers are the ones who are buying those, not investors. And so again, that reserve requirement is really important for that owner occupancy ratio. So I've talked a little bit tonight on this concept of fully funding versus is fully funded. And lawyers, we get hung up on the smallest of things. And sometimes the last 2 or 3 letters of a word makes a lot of difference, because there is a difference between fully funding and fully funded. Fully funding is following a plan, which is what almost all of you regularly do. You're putting money away every year, and you're probably spending some money every year. And so sometimes you'll look at your reserve balances, and if you looked at it and you had to graph it out, it'll look like a roller coaster where the balance goes up and down as you're saving money, and then you spend it, and you save it again, and you spend it. That's okay. Fully funding is what we're supposed to be doing. We're supposed to be putting enough money away so that way when our major capital expenses come up, we have enough money to replace them. But what we're not usually is fully funded. And what fully funded is over a period of time, let's say a same 10 or 15 year period, having all of the money that we ever need. If we need $1 million over the next 10 years, we just need to be funding that reserve account so it goes up and down. So over the course of the 10 years, we have $1 million. We don't need $1 million in the bank account today, unless we have $1 million in capital items today, in which case we probably do. And if that's the case, and we need another $1 million 2 years from now, we need to be on a plan so that way we not only have $1 million for today, but we have $1 million for the couple years from now when we're going to need that extra money. And so we need to have a plan. And that's really the difference between fully funding versus fully funded. Really, the only associations that are ever fully funded are some homeowners associations with very little capital items. You know, you've got an entrance sign and maybe some fencing. And to fix that entrance sign and the fencing is going to cost $10,000. And you've got that in the bank. Okay, great. So that entrance sign is going to need to be replaced in 10 years. You've got the money. You're fully funded. So that means you don't need to be putting a bunch of money into reserves over the next 10 years because you've already got it. If that's your community, I'd like to know about it, because it sounds like I'd like to live there because you fully funded, but that's the exception. Again, not the norm. Fully funding is what most associations do. How do we figure out what that is? We get a reserve study. And this is a really super, super important document. And so I'm going to spend some time here now on reserve studies, because what a reserve study is, it's really a planning tool. It's a long-term capital planning tool, usually prepared by an expert. Sometimes it's a PE, a professional engineer. Sometimes it's a reserve specialist. CAI has a credentialing. The Community Association Institute has a credentialing thing for reserve specialists, people who just do this for community associations. And so super important to get reserve studies prepared by one of those people that really details out the funding plan to put your specific community on track to avoid special assessments. Because again, that's the goal. We've got to have a plan to be fully funding to avoid special assessments. So a couple of common things on that. You know, the process is the same regardless of the size of the association. I'm going to talk about the process next. And really the number of capital items, I'll say, is what indicates, do you really need this study or not? If you're that HOA that I mentioned before with just the entrance sign, you probably don't need a full reserve study. You can probably just go to a contractor and ask them for their general protection, add in some inflation, and you can figure it out. But anything more than that, you really want to have that independent professional advice. And we'll talk about why a little bit later. But ultimately, what it does is it consists of a very detailed and elaborate study of both the physical and financial health and projections of the community. So how does it do that? First, we do a capital item inventory. And this is a big one. They make a list of every single thing the association's responsible for. We make a list of all of those capital items. And it's important to get it right because we need to know how many linear square feet of gutters there are, or how many square feet of asphalt or whatever there is. It's also, I will tell you, important to not overlook items, particularly items that are overlooked by the eye. What I'm talking about here, subterranean components. A lot of communities have stuff underground. You've got sewer pipes and water laterals and foundations and all this kind of stuff that sometimes is existing underneath the surface that you've never seen before. Well, guess what? Those things go bad too. Sometimes associations are responsible for utility infrastructure like electrical transformers and things of that nature. Those get super pricey. And that's not something that you and I in our normal course of just single family budgeting ever understand or expect because we don't have transformers, right? But the association might. And so it's important to make sure in the first step that we get every single item that the association is responsible for. Step 2 then is probably the more complicated part of it for the reserve professionals, and that is they have all of the list of items, and then they have to do an assessment of all of those items. What's each single one's current condition? In other words, how much time left do we have on this component? Is our transformer going to last 3 years? Is it going to last 20 years? Is it going to last 200 years? How long is that component going to last? What is its remaining useful life? Then we have to figure out, usually based on actuarial tables, okay, what's the replacement cost going to be at the end of that useful life? So we project out the useful life, and then we estimate what that replacement cost is going to be. And then when we have those things, we can have a really big chart that step 3 establishes the reserve funding plan. This is what should tell us every year over the next 10 to 30 years of whatever the study projects, how much we're going to need every year. So then based on that, we can back in the math. I can't do the math for you. So I say we, but I'm a lawyer. I don't do anything about math. That's why I went to law school. The accountants and the engineers who are good at math can figure that out and say, this is how much money we need to be putting away every year. And that's what gets us our reserve funding plan. So some additional notes on reserve studies. First thing that often comes up is, how often do we get these things? And historically, the answer was every 5 to 7 years, as my slide pointed out. But you may remember earlier, I mentioned mortgage companies now are asking for reserve studies that aren't more than 3 years old. And so the trend is actually to have them updated even more. Especially if you think you're not funding, reserve companies are going to be asking for the study. And if that's the case, it's probably going to be less than 3 years. The good news about that is that typically reserve updates are less expensive than doing the full study. You know, they maybe just need to look at some of the things again. They don't need to do the remeasuring all of the gutters and the asphalt. That should all be done already. And so a bunch of the time that goes into preparing the first version of the study hopefully isn't necessary for the updates. So less expensive from a budgeting perspective. When you get the reserve study, though, one of the things that I would really encourage you to do is evaluate it, right? Disagree with the numbers, as the slide says, because sometimes you'll see something in there and it makes no sense. You'd be like, oh my gosh, why did you budget X for this? We just did this last year and it costs X minus 90%. Well, have that conversation with the reserve engineer, and sometimes they will in fact modify those numbers based on your practical experience. Another thing to really look at is what the inflation and the interest rates are. Interest rates are super high today, historically speaking, over the last 20 20 years or so, we haven't seen rates quite this high. Maybe not historically high in, grand scheme of history, but in recent history, they're high. But over the course of a 20-year period, they're not always at 4 to 5%, right? It sometimes levels out and it might be 2 or 3. So whatever that interest rate can be set at, or whatever that inflation rate can be set at, has a tendency to really move the needle. And so that's why you want to typically look at these things as averages, not necessarily the current condition. If you've got 7 or 8% inflation every year for the next 30 years, your study is probably going to get out of whack. And it's likely that we're not going to have 7 or 8% inflation for the next 30 years. If we do, we're probably all in bigger trouble than what we're in right now. So our reserve study will be the least of our concerns. If you need the names of reserve study companies, you can feel free to reach out to Associa, or if you're one of our clients, you can reach out to us. We're happy to give you names of people that can do it. A common question that we get from board members is, can we do it ourselves? I have a construction background or something of that nature. And the answer to that is, I suppose, technically yes. But if you're going to do this, here's what you got to do. You got to go to Amazon, something like that. And you've got to order the brightest yellow jacket you can find. It's got to be super bright. Maybe even like a hood on it, just really bright and as long as you can, so it really sticks out. You're going to get that jacket in the mail. And then what I want you to do is either take it to like an embroidery shop, or maybe just get some like duct tape. And on the front and back of the jacket, I want you to spell out the word liability. Liability on the front and the back. Because what you're going to have to do when you're preparing the study is you're going to have to go out and look at all these components and figure all this out. And so the purpose of the jacket is to make sure everybody else in the community knows who to sue when it's not right. Because they're coming after you. Because that's what happens. If the reserve company's wrong, we're going to go after them. And so if you're the one who's preparing the study, you have to know we're going after you. Your role as a board member is to show up at meetings and vote. That's really what the governing documents say that your job, so to speak, is as a board member. It is not to go out and evaluate the useful life. Reliance on a professional is a defense. And so the law encourages you to do that. When you don't do that, that's when you're taking the liability on yourself. So as long as you're willing to put on that jacket and advertise completely to all of your friends and neighbors who live around you that you're going to be the one responsible for it, sure, go have at it. Just know you might get a letter from me someday. More questions and answers on reserve studies, again, that we get all the time. How do you convince a board a reserve study is necessary? Sometimes, you'll have one board member and the other board members think, we're not spending the money. And I would tell you pretty much today, you're crazy if you don't. And one of the ways that I like to talk about reserve studies is it's such a good information tool, not just for the board, but for the current owners. So that way they can see what's happening. I know in my association, people ask us all the time, like, are fees going up next year? And our answer is probably, yeah. Look at the reserve study. The reserve study tells us that we have to increase our reserve contribution a certain percentage every year for the next 20 years. So yeah, at a minimum, we got to increase our reserves. We'll do what we can to keep our operating costs flat, but you should see at a minimum, we're going to have to raise our reserve contribution. So it tells current owners, here's what we project. It also is a really good tool for potential owners. And that's where I like this first bullet point. A reserve study is almost like a home inspection for the common ones. Most people, when they move into a community and they buy a new house, they get a home inspection, right? And that inspector comes out and they look at everything that's part of that house. They look at the dishwasher and the furnace and the windows and all that kind of stuff. But when you move into a community association, you're also buying a portion of everything that's common. You're buying a portion of the roofs and the roads and everything else. Home inspector doesn't look at that. And so a reserve engineer does, though. And so that's why prudent home buyers also should be requesting copies of reserve studies. So that way they can see, here's what we're in for. We want to know before you buy if you can actually afford to live here over the long term. Next question, how long should the study last? We see them all over the board. I would say a minimum of 20 years. keeping in mind that they get updated every 3 to 5 is probably safe. But we see outlier windows at 30, sometimes 40 years for bigger high rises. But most communities, anywhere in a 20 to 30 year projection is good. Next question, sometimes things will happen, right? We miss the subterranean component. What happens if there's a component that, shoot, we just missed, but now it needs replacing? Can we use reserves on it? Yes, as long as it's a capital item. So like I said at the beginning, we can use reserves on repair and replacement of our major capital items. We can't on operating. So as long as it's a capital item, we can. We just need to know then that that wasn't budgeted. So if we took $50,000 out of the reserves that we weren't anticipating, that means there's some other components out there that are going to need that money. So we're going to have to make up that shortfall and recalibrate the plan, which is why if you have one of those big expenses that didn't come up, you may want to get a reserve study update. Likewise, sometimes the reverse will happen. Sometimes that hailstorm from heaven will hit. Right. And so you're supposed to be funding for roofs for the next 10 years, but you get a new roof this year. Now those new roofs last 30 years. And so we can push it out. That's another reason in reverse, you want to get the study updated. And then finally, can we pay for the reserve study with reserve funds? This is a common question. My answer to that is technically no, because the reserve study is actually an operating cost. It's an engineering study. It's not repair or replacement of an actual capital item. That's different if you have engineering expenses for the actual replacement. If you bring on an engineer to help you with the roof replacement or the siding replacement, that can be considered part of the project. But actually getting just the projection study usually isn't. So perhaps what's the bottom line for you as board members? What do you really want to know out of this tonight? And that is avoid liability and fund reserves. Right? That's the biggest thing that you can do. Avoid liability and fund reserves. The law, whether it's a state law or whether it's the mortgagee provisions now, are really designed as consumer protections. We want to protect everybody who owns in a community to make sure that their investment is sound. And so that's why I think our best advice is obtain a professional reserve study. Share the reserve study with the owners, and then budget in accordance with the study. If you do that, that's your best way to avoid liability. It's not overly complicated. I mean, sometimes boards will think that it is, but it's not overly complicated. We don't have a whole lot of options like in this cartoon here. And so we just want to make sure that we're budgeting for reserves and we're educating the owners on that. I will note, because there's a provision on this slide, there used to be a reference in Ohio law that said you had to put in 10% of your budget into reserves. And one of the things that the legislature did was delete that provision in 2022. And the reason that they did that was because a lot of boards were making the mistake of thinking that the law said that 10% was sufficient, that if we put 10% away, we were compliant with the law. That's actually not really ever what the law said. The law said we're supposed to be putting away enough money to avoid special assessments, and it shouldn't be less than 10% and all this. But they got rid of all that to avoid the confusion. So now it's just very clear. They don't care what the percentage is, whether it's 2% or 20% or 40 or 50%. We have to be putting enough money away to avoid special assessments. If your board hasn't been doing that, it's a hard pill to swallow. But you gotta stop making excuses and kicking the can down the road, because really what you're doing is you're just making it harder for people in the future, right? If we're not funding reserves today, that just means that's more money that people in the future are going to have to pay. And, every once in a while, I will go to an annual meeting and there's somebody in the audience who's like the guy in this cartoon. Why should I contribute to reserves? At my age, I don't even buy green bananas because I'm not going to be here. Why do I need to fund reserves? And my answer to that is usually a couple things. First, I hope you are here. I had a story. I'll tell you for 30 seconds. I go to this meeting and we're talking about reserves and funding it. And there was a lady sitting in the front row who was just like this guy with the banana. I'm going to be dead. I'm not going to have to pay for this. You are really putting the screws to the owners. And, I can't afford this. I'm 80. And she leads the groundswell, and the owners ultimately decide we're going to waive the reserve funding requirement. 3 years later, 3 years later, guess what they had to do? They had to levy a huge special assessment. So I go back to the same meeting. And who's sitting in the front row but this same lady? And, we explain the whole thing, and it gets to the Q&A time, and she starts going off railing about how we're putting the screws to the people and all the same stuff. And I said, oh, it is so great to see you here tonight. I don't know if you remember, but 3 years ago, you sat in the same position and you said you weren't going to be here. You didn't think you were going to make it, and you wouldn't have had to increase the reserves. But here you are. So I'm so glad to see you that you're still here. But unfortunately, because we didn't fund those reserves as you suggested, now you're going to have to pay the special assessment because, as you also pointed out, every time it rains, it leaks in your kitchen and we need new roofs. And so we have to do it. It's now time to pay the piper. So the remedy here is simple. Either we do a reserve study, share its contents with the owners, and budget accordingly, or the alternative, as I mentioned, is to do the reserve study, share the contents with the owners, and get that reserve waiver. I want to be clear. I'm not recommending the waiver. I think it's typically a bad idea. But is it an option? Yes. It's only an option, though, if the board thinks it is. The obligation first, going back to that law, is on the board. What does the board think we need to do? If the board thinks we need to fund reserves, that's the board's decision. If the board doesn't want to fund reserves, then it has to go to a vote of the owners and get their permission to waive the reserve funding requirement. And that's where a majority vote is required in writing every year to do this reserve thing. One question that comes up is, hey, our association has too much money. What do we do? Again, I'd like to know who you are so I can move there. But if that's the case and you want to put zero into reserves, should we still be getting a majority vote of the owners? Yes. Yes, you should, because we're putting nothing in. Now, if on the same time you think we're avoiding a special assessment, then the answer might be, well, maybe we don't need a waiver. And so that's, again, something where we want to talk to you and figure out what's the best way to protect you from liability. My experience, this is not something that typically happens. If you are doing this, though, if you are getting the reserve waivers, then a couple suggestions there, not really suggestions. First, keep the ballots forever. There's likely to be a lawsuit because, again, you're waiving the requirement. You're not going to have the money in the bank, which means you're going to have to special assess. That special assessment is going to lead to bad things, as we talked about at the beginning, and litigation is almost always one of them. Sometimes it's, again, owners suing the association. More often than not, it's the association suing an owner, like foreclosing or getting a money judgment against them because they didn't pay their special assessment. We're going to need the evidence to be able to sufficiently prosecute that case for good or for ill. And our evidence there are the reserve ballots. So keep them forever. And again, they have to be in writing. So it used to be that we could do it by motion at an annual meeting, but not anymore. The law changed and was clarified on that. We need actual ballots in writing every year if we're going to do reserve waivers. Again, I don't recommend this. This is not something that I think is something to aspire to. It's just something, if you feel like your association's in that position, then you need to get the waiver. You need to get a majority vote every year. And here's the process to follow. So after all of that, I think we've come to our bottom line, which is my recommendation tonight. Fully fund the reserves, right? Financially unhealthy communities are not something that you want to be, because those are communities that experience deferred maintenance. They experience special assessments, which are no good. Certainly unfavorable lending conditions, which usually leads to higher investor ownership and therefore also tenant occupancy, and then lower home values because of the special assessments and the owner occupancy rates and the deferred maintenance. That has a direct and immediate impact on those values, whereas financially healthy communities are characterized by higher home values, hopefully monthly assessments that are realistic and that advertise to people this is actually what it's going to take to live here, so potential purchasers are on notice, and then favorable lending conditions, so that way units can be bought and sold, hopefully for those higher values. To me, it's clear. Boards today, more than ever, have a mandate to maintain your community. And the way that mandate is most clearly effectuated is by boards preparing for and funding for reserves. Whew.
Excellent.
Well, that was a lot.
That was very informative. Thank you so much. We did have one question come in. I'd be happy to read it aloud, or if you want to.
Sure. What do you got?
Okay, so we are a very small subdivision with the HOA, only 83 homes with 3 common areas. Only 2 things that have potential for large repair: a sidewalk fronting the main road and a pond. The question is, what sort of things can the reserve funds be used for? We did have a situation where the pond needed some remediation per the city and more recently damaged the front of the community by a stolen vehicle. Are either of these items something where we can allocate some of our reserves to fund that?
Good questions. I think there was really like 5 questions.
There's a couple.
One question, which was good. Thinking like a lawyer. I like it. So answering it perhaps in turn, the first, and I sort of mentioned this in my remarks, as far as, just analyzing your capital items, to me, it's not necessarily just the quantity that's important. It's what those items are. So you might say just a sidewalk or just some ponds, but those can be super expensive things. It's a sidewalk, but it might be a mile of sidewalk, right? That's a lot of sidewalk. And if it's a cement sidewalk, that gets really expensive. And so having an understanding of what our costs are going to be for that is really important. And when you're talking about other things like ponds, there's a lot that goes into that. So when we're talking about ponds, and typically we're talking about stormwater management ponds, those were designed to hold a certain amount of water for the stormwater, right? So they're at different depths and stuff like that. And so we need to maintain that pond to hold whatever it was designed for stormwater, or else we're going to have flooding and everything else. That can mean, for example, dredging of ponds. That can mean putting in new riprap and erosion control on the sides of the ponds. All of those things can be capital because the pond is a man-made feature for the purpose of stormwater. And so we can use reserve funds on any repair replacement of major capital items like the pond. What we can't do, and where we have to be careful, is pond beautification is not. So, you'll get these pond expenses because algae and stuff like that is growing. And so they say, hey, we want to treat the pond to make it look pretty. Making it look pretty is not extending the life of the pond. And so that, for example, would not be a reserve expense. That would be an operating expense. But what can you use reserve funds on? I think was the last kind of concept. Again, it's repair and replacement of major capital items.
Perfect. I just want to remind folks that the Q&A features at the bottom of your screen. We had another question come through. How much is enough to put away for reserves? I used to say 10%. Now what would be the best answer? Sorry about that.
Best answer. Yeah, no, best answer is whatever's necessary to avoid special assessments. It's not a percentage. That's the thing about the percentages. That was arbitrary. For some communities, that might be sufficient. For most, it's not, either up or down. So it doesn't matter what your neighbor across the street's doing. It doesn't matter what an association in Cleveland's doing. It matters what is necessary for your community to avoid a special assessment. And that's where getting a reserve study and figuring out how much that number is enough to be putting away.
Okay.
The correlation to that is we also don't want to be overfunded. You know what I mean? And so like sometimes it's pin the tail on the donkey and you say, well, we picked 20%, but then you get the reserve study and we only needed 12. And so now we've been overfunding. We don't want to do that either. We want enough to avoid the necessity of a special assessment. And that's really about it. Sometimes there's a pad, right? Like we don't want the reserve account to drop below a certain number. Okay, that's reasonable and fair for unanticipated contingencies, but we don't want too much money.
That's a good point that you brought up. So I've seen in HOAs where, they've decided to lower dues because they felt that they've had a healthy enough reserve. Any comment on that?
If in fact they do, that's great.
Okay. So you just recommend essentially leveraging the vendors through the management company and making sure they're on track with the expenses for any capital projects if they only have a couple amenities or something like that.
But even in that circumstance, I would still probably suggest a reserve study. And that's where, like, going back to the first question, I like circumstances where if we have sidewalks and we have ponds, we're going to get a reserve study. And that reserve study is not going to be super expensive because there's only a sidewalk and pond, but that's the independent professional advice that we can rely on. So that way we can go to the owners in good faith and saying, we got this independent expert opinion. It's not the pond contractor. It's not the sidewalk contractor. We went to an independent professional. I'm okay with going to contractors for small dollar amount stuff. If you have a front entrance sign and it's made of wood and that's it, or it's made of stone and that's it, and it's going to last 100 years because it's been there for 100 years and we all know this, okay, fine, go to the contractor because it's a small dollar amount. But when you're talking about something like ponds and sidewalks, and when you talk about like amenities, like playgrounds cost a couple $100,000 today. Putting in a new pool costs a couple $100,000. Playgrounds are stupid expensive. Never understood how expensive playgrounds were until I started seeing them in studies. Wild.
Definitely agree with that. Let's see, we got one more that came through. As I recall, the reserves must be equal or greater than the study at the end of each year. Is there a major unexpected item? Sorry, if there's a major unexpected item depletes the reserve so that the reserves at the end of the year are less than the study, what do you suggest?
Really depends on how much less and where you're at in your cycle. If you're at year 2 or 3 of your 5-year reserve cycle and it only depleted at a couple $1,000, maybe more than expected, then you're probably okay to let it ride until the study updates. If, on the other hand, it's a substantial deviation, if you spent 40% more or something of that nature than what your study wanted you to have at the end of the year, then that's probably something where you should go and get an update to the study, just so that way we know in future years we're making up for that to put enough money away. It's quite possible that your next major capital expense gets put off because you just did it, right? You had something 3 years down the road that you move forward. And so those things can move around. And that's where just utilizing the expertise and the math can hopefully help figure that out. And if it truly was unexpected, if it wasn't projected years down the road, that's again where if we spend $100,000 more, we're going to need that 100K someplace else. And so we're going to want to know that sooner than later. How much runway do we have to build that back up? Is it 2 years? Is it 5 years? Is it 10? And getting an updated study does that.
Okay, so you recommend going back to the reserve company that you used to initially create the study to revise those figures after some sort of unexpected depletion of the funds.
Yeah, usually when an association gets a reserve study, they go back to the same company to do the updates just because they're familiar with it and everything else. And that's where there's an economy of scale. If you think that the first reserve study was terrible, right, then they missed they missed putting in roofs, and that was unanticipated, or they probably shouldn't have missed roofs, then maybe it's time to look at a new reserve study company. That's not typically the case, but it can be. And that's where maybe it is a brand new study and not just an update if they miss something so glaring.
Okay.
But if they miss something so glaring, that also could be a liability issue, which you could talk to your attorneys about. Like, hey, every reserve professional in the world would have known that this condominium has roofs that needed to go in the reserve study. Why didn't they put them in? That's when they're wearing that bright yellow liability jacket.
Right. Okay. Well, we have 2 minutes left. I don't see any other questions come through. But thank you for your time this evening. If anyone has any questions for myself or Jeff, please feel free to reach out. And we appreciate your time.
No, really thank you, and thank all the board members for attending tonight. I know serving on the board is a voluntary position, and so spending your evening with me is not exactly the compensation you were hoping for. So I appreciate your time tonight.
But you made it fun and engaging, so that's the important part, right? Excellent. Well, have a great evening. Thank you so much.
Have a good night, everybody.